How beautiful is this morning? Holy patoli. It is gorgeous outside. Like, I love how God changes things all the time, isn't it? Like, those of us that living in California, or that grew up outside of California, we understand weather change. You guys that grew up in California, just so you know, this is what's called weather change. It's a normal part of it. It's not every day 75 and sunny. And so then finally when the warm weather comes, you're like, oh, yes. It's like the change of season. And I think we're going to get 3 days of spring, and then it's back to cold, and then it'll be hot. And it's so hard to live in Southern California. How do we do it? So, well, let me just start off with 3 things here as we get going this morning, just so you're all aware of it. As a lot of you know, Pat McCoy went to be with Jesus a few weeks ago, and I was even this morning thinking about it. What is it like right now for him? Just being in the presence of Jesus, the longing that all of us have. And so he's great, but for us as people, funerals are more for us as an opportunity to be thankful towards God, to grieve. And so on May 13th, we're going to have his memorial service here at 11 a.m. And so I would just love it if all of you could make it. Pat has been a part, Linda has been a part of Cornerstone for years, and super thankful for him and just the reality that God allowed him to be a part of our life. And so we're gonna celebrate Jesus as we celebrate the victory of Jesus over death in regards to Pat. I love it, man. Oh, death, where's your sting? It's gone. And I just love that for Pat McCoy. That's the first thing. Second thing is remember, right, we asked you to pray and even to consider maybe fasting once a week. We presented 2 elders, Bob Krychek, which I don't know, I was going to point him out. Where are you at, Bob? Way back in the back. He's a back row Baptist. And so if anybody wants to put that on his form, no, but we've asked you to give us feedback to some of the members. We've asked you to give us feedback. We sent you a form to be able to fill out to either just things that you really appreciate about the person, or even if you have any concerns to let us know, and or even if you don't even know who they are and just want to say, hey, we're praying and excited for where God's taking us. We'd love to hear from you. If you didn't receive that form, you can walk up to any of us that are elders in this particular room, or you can email. You can go and you can find our faces on there and send us emails. You can call us. You can speak to us in person. But we would love to hear from you as we continue to pray for both of those guys. The other guy is Jose Luis Amasquita. He's actually probably preaching right now over in the service that we have for those that their primary language is Spanish. And so for both of those particular guys, we're really excited about what God might do as they shepherd in a place like Cornerstone. So please be praying, but let us know if you have any feedback. And then just the last thing is, I'm going to be taking a sabbatical coming up on May 23rd. Let me explain to you sabbatical. Sometimes pastors take sabbaticals because they're crashing and burning. I don't think I'm crashing and burning. We try to view sabbaticals as way more proactive than reactive. Is that we just believe, man, we want our pastors to be healthy. We want our pastors to make sure that when they're calling other people to love Jesus, that they love Jesus, that they love their wives, that they love their kiddos. And so we take these things called sabbaticals. I'll start at the end of May and go through right about the beginning of August. And so I know one person said, you're going on a sabbatical. Does that mean you're leaving? No. A couple churches, churches do approach every once in a while and say, hey, would you want to come do what you did with Cornerstone when Francis left? And I'm like, oh no, I do not want to do that again. Not a chance in the world. So just, 10 years ago, I went on sabbatical. I didn't have a midlife crisis. I came back. I love this church. Like this right here, I'm so excited that of God's greater spiritual family, I get to be here. And I get to be a part of other leaders that are seeking to bring about just health, Christ-likeness in all of us, so that we might be the church that God's intending us to be. So anyways, those are some of the 3 things to keep in the back of your mind before we start going. But if you're new here, we're in the book of Matthew. It's the first gospel. If you need a Bible, we're going to have some people coming down. You can raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like a Bible. If you don't have one, it's a gift from us to you. Matthew's the first gospel, like I said, and if you don't know where it's at, either you can nudge the person next to you and say, hey, where's this Matthew book that he's talking about? Or even there's a table of contents, you can go look it up. But we're going to be in Matthew, and we're going to be in chapter 9. And really what we've been doing is we've been looking at this Jesus as not just anybody, but truly as the Messiah that the people of Israel had longed for. Over and over again, whether we're in chapter 1 in the genealogy, whether we're talking about the prophecies that came afterwards, the way in which Jesus was tempted, the way in which he walked through his baptism, the miracles, the teaching, every facet of it that Matthew's been highlighting and looking at Jesus is to make sure that every one of us know Matthew is saying to us, I've walked with Jesus, and in fact we learned that he's one of the apostles, and he wants us to get Jesus isn't just anybody. He is the long-awaited Messiah. He's the one you've been waiting for. He's the one that the Old Testament is promising, that he's going to take all that is wrong from the fall and he's going to make it right. And so that's been just the beating drum throughout we've been looking at. And last week, Christian finished with this idea of new wineskins, meaning when Jesus came into this world, we know that heaven broke into this world in a powerful way. And when he broke in, let me tell you this, nothing will be the same. The moment Jesus showed up on this planet, truly God, truly man, truly Messiah, is that now we were set in motion everything that we know, that we come to the book of Revelation where finally all things will be made right. Matthew's whole point is this guy that we saw, that we walked with, isn't just anybody. He was the long-awaited one, the Messiah, who is going to right all things and restore all things to the God's intent. And let me tell you something. If you don't get that from the book of Matthew, read it again. Like, you can't miss that. And so we've been looking at it from one aspect, really focusing on Jesus. But today what I want to do is I want to show you, because we're also needing to talk about us as disciples. How do disciples respond to Messiah? Well, the one thing you're going to see is either people responding rightly in faith or not rightly in faith. Let me get about my thing. But Jesus is going to respond to those two particular groups of people. This idea of faith, and we're going to clarify it as we go through it. But one of the key realities of a disciple who then makes disciples, because that's what he's talking about in the book of Matthew, is this idea of faith. Now, where we're at in this story is pretty cool, is that Jesus now had been kind of laying out these ideas, and it says in there, when you look down at verse 18, it says, while he was saying these things, in other words, while he's sitting there interacting with people, we see the word behold. Now, if you also haven't read Matthew much, he says behold over and over and over and over again. In fact, you're going to see it just in this text. This word behold, what it kind of means is you got to check this out or you're never going to believe this. In a lot of ways, Matthew is like my kids. Dad, you got to check this out. Everything, Dad, you got to check this out. Dad, you got to check this out. Matthew's like my children. He's going to constantly say, you've got to see this thing. Check this out. And he's going to tell us now the story of a ruler. Specifically, he's a ruler inside of the synagogue. You'll see that like when we get to the book of Mark, he's one of the rulers there, is that he's one of the chief people of this town. He wasn't a paid person. He wasn't a paid pastor. He was a lay person. But he oversaw the place of worship in which they'd gather in Capernaum, because that's where we are. And if you've ever seen this before, this guy is sitting there. We're going to learn why he wants to talk to Jesus, but I don't know if you've ever been there where you know somebody wants to talk to you, but you're talking to somebody else. And here's this guy, and his name we find out is Jairus. That's what else we learn in Luke, is that in this, he wants to talk to him specifically now about his daughter. Now, you know this, man, when mama and daddy start talking about kiddos, it starts getting serious. Now, the thing that we know about his daughter, she was about 12 years of age, so she was still a young girl, kind of moving into becoming a woman. But the other thing that we talk about is he's getting there, is that in Matthew it tells us she has just died. In Luke it says she was dying. She was at the point of death in Mark. And just so you know, it's not a discrepancy. It's just Mark and Luke tell the big long story. Matthew just wants to get right to the point. He's just making sure that we get, and that the big key issue there is that she's not mostly dead like in Princess Bride. He wants everyone to know that Jairus' 12-year-old daughter is dead. Now, just for a second, use your imagination. What would this man be like? I'm sure he's sitting there while Jesus is talking, and he's sitting there fidgeting and just waiting to talk to Jesus. And finally, Jesus looks at him, and I love how it says this in Mark 5:23, my little daughter. Like, I don't think he said, my little daughter. I think he's a dad here. My little girl. I want to talk to you about my little girl. Now again, whether we're talking Mark or Luke, in which they stretch the story, or in the book of Matthew, the key issue that he's trying to get there is that regardless of how you look at it, his daughter is dead. Again, sometimes I feel like we take the emotion out of a text like this and miss the fact of just a dad pleading before Jesus. It's my little girl. She's dead. Let's just feel the weight of that for a second. And what's fascinating is what he says to him. Here's the thing, Jesus, this is what I know about you. I believe that if you come and if you lay your hand on her, she will live. See where he's going here? It's faith. Sometimes the thing I found about faith, and this is one of the things you have to understand about it, is faith is at this place in which you realize, I can do nothing. But also something else is key there. Look at that word. If you lay what? Your hand. Faith isn't like, and again, I'm going to totally date myself, but for those of you who are older, remember George Michael's song? You got to have? Oh, it goes further than that. Faith, the faith, the faith. I got to have faith, the faith, the faith. I won't sing the rest of it because it's not good. Where he puts his faith is all kinds of wrong, if you know what I'm saying. But sometimes we treat faith like it's just this weird thing. Just have faith in faith. He doesn't say to Jesus, hey, I have faith, the faith, the faith. He says, I have faith in you. That's faith. Faith isn't in a concept, it's in a person. See, this is what us as disciples, this is what we need to know. This is what Matthew's trying to get across. Jesus is truly Messiah, the anointed one, the long-awaited one. That's who he is, but who disciples are faith. But their faith is not in themselves. Their faith is not in their circumstances. Their faith is not in faith, the faith, the faith. Their faith is in a person, Jesus Christ. And that's where this guy is. And with what he understands, that's what he's saying. Jesus, I don't know everything else, but my faith is in you. It is the heartbroken faith. Now, on some levels, it's like, well, we should have probably enhanced his view of faith. There's so much more to understand about faith. But one of the things that I love is that nobody has like the perfect faith. But the thing I want you to see this in this moment, what he knew about Jesus, the belief that he had in him, Jesus met him there. Like if you could just imagine, it says Jesus rose and followed him. Now, what would this dad be doing? I'm imagining myself, I'm saying, hey, Brianna or Ryan, my two girls, they've died. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, if you just come and lay, and probably in the back of my head, I'm like, he's probably not going to come. And it doesn't say that Jesus went, It just says he rose and he followed him. What was that daddy like? Right? He's just like, sorry, I don't look very nimble. He was probably more nimble than me. But I just love this. Jesus, it says, rose and he followed him. We also find out from Mark, it says a great crowd followed him, that the thronged about him, right? So it's not just Jesus, but it takes his disciple, or the apostles, the disciples that are with him. It also says that they were pressing it around him. In other words, a mob heard about this, and now they're going to follow Jesus with Jairus, the head of the synagogue, and they're going to walk through town, and it's this throng of people. But here's the key. Jesus met Jairus in his faith. The thing about faith is that's where Jesus meets us. But not just faith, faith in him. What it says in there is he's walking along. Here's our word. What's the first word after and? And? Told you, he's like my kids. Dude, check this out. You won't believe this, what's going on now. Now, on some levels, right, here's the dad going, come on, Jesus, we got to get going. And all of a sudden, look down in the text, it says this in there, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood, some kind of menstrual bleeding, for 12 years comes into the story. Now, what we also learn from the book of Mark is this is a lady that had done everything that she could to try to get rid of this bleeding that she had had. And listen to me, when we talk about this, it's not just that she had a physical ailment. We know this because we understand Leviticus 15, that if a woman had this problem, she couldn't be around people. She was unclean. That means if a husband had married her, he probably divorced her because she couldn't have children. If she wasn't married, nobody was going to marry her. She was childless. She was kind of in an outcast of society. No one wanted to be near her because anything even she sat on, if they sat on, they were unclean. And here's this woman, and again, in this moment, you have a daddy who's pulling him along that has heartbroken faith. But I would say this, there's another woman that's about ready to express faith as well. We find out that she came up behind him. Okay, I can imagine there's this crowd of people around, and she comes up behind him, man. She's commando. Now, why did she come up behind him? Everybody would have known who she was. They would have known that she was unclean. And she was trying to figure out, as this Jesus was walking by to go deal with Jairus and his daughter, how in the world do I get to him? Because she had faith as well. Let me show you what I'm talking about. See, in this, it says not only that she was seeking to reach out to him, and in some ways she's sneaking up, and it would have been scandalous. And what I mean by that is that if they would have known she was sneaking to do it, everybody would have got out of her way. She couldn't come to the front. She couldn't come from the side. She had to sneak in this woman. So on one hand, she's being kind of a little bit scandalous. She's trying to get to Jesus in a way that everybody else would have fled away. But there's another side of it. It says she touched his tassel. Why'd she do that? Was that just the last grab as she dove, and she kind of caught it? I don't think so. See, most people that understand this time, what they do is they connect it to this idea of an understanding in Numbers 15, and I think also it talks about in Deuteronomy 22 of these tassels, these four corners that would hang down off the cloaks of men that were respected, especially Jewish men within culture. Now, we don't know why, but somewhere along the line, those particular tassels almost became magical in some way. There was a power to them. Not only those, but you'll see like in the book of Acts, people even thought like if the shadow of a great man would pass over them, they could be healed, or Paul's handkerchiefs being sent all over to be healed. But in some ways, there was a superstitious component to who this lady was. Not only was it scandalous, but she was superstitious. This is the kind of faith, and again, we might go, well, I'm sure Jesus really did the 1-2 with her. We don't deal with superstitious, nor do we deal with scandalous faith. But I think the key here is this. She said to herself, which is actually kind of cool. She said to herself, the only reason probably we know she said to herself is she probably followed Jesus along the way and told somebody, this is what I was thinking at that particular moment. If I only touch his garment, I'll be made well. Now here's the key. Touch whose garment? It's the object of her faith. It was messed up in a lot of ways, superstitious, scandalous, kind of like the heartbroken dad. He didn't have it all together. But let's be honest, do any of us really have it all together? The key is the object of her faith. That's what she saw. So in other words, we have heartbroken faith, we have scandalous, superstitious faith, but here's the greatest thing in the world. I love this. Jesus met her there. In that moment of everything we find out in Mark and Luke, he actually said, first of all, who touched me? Because there's like people everywhere all around him. But he looks then down at her in that moment and doesn't just say anything. He doesn't say, hey, you're welcome, and he keeps walking. He says, take heart, daughter. That's family. It wasn't just that she was well. See, this woman would have been ostracized. In other words, he was saying, welcome back to the family. You're in. Now imagine this lady at that moment. I'm in. I've paid all this money. I've gone to all kinds of doctors. Her faith was in money, her faith was in doctors, but suddenly, all of a sudden, things shifted, and her faith was in Jesus. And I love this. Jesus met her there. Your faith has made you well. And I love this. And instantly the woman was made well. But it's faith in Jesus. Now, while all this is going on, finally, right, Jesus comes to the ruler's house. You know, Jairus is probably like, Jesus, come on, man. We got to get going. But in some ways, I wonder, in the sovereignty of God, if he orchestrated for this lady to come up, not only for her healing and acceptance to encounter faith in which she met Jesus. Sometimes I wonder if God did it on purpose to make sure that people knew she wasn't just kind of dead, she was dead. We know by this time at the ruler's house, there were flute players and there were people that were crowded around. And sometimes people wonder, why in the world is there a flute at a funeral? I mean, can you imagine, on May 13th, if I walk in and we're there to celebrate Jesus and to honor Pat, and I come in playing a flute? In our culture, we'd be like, I think Todd does need sabbatical. I think he's lost it. But at that time, they had what were called professional mourners. In fact, even a poor person had to have one flute and two mourners there, or they couldn't have their funeral. And in this time then, if you think about it, Jairus, who's the leader of the synagogue, he wouldn't have had just two people and a flute player. He would have had an all-out flute band. I don't know what that would have looked like, because I'm not a huge flute person, a flautist. But there's another side of it where people everywhere, and they would have been mourning and going through everything. Now, here's what's so cool about this next part. Before we'd seen this man, and then we saw this woman with menstrual bleeding, but now we're going to see this crowd that had gathered. We're going to learn something about their faith. Now, I love what Jesus says in there, right? He says, go away. Goodbye. Bye-bye. Right? He just tells them, go away. And then here's what he says next. I love this. The girl's not dead, but sleeping. Now, in that moment, again, just so you know, Jesus oftentimes alludes to the future. We're going to learn over and over throughout the New Testament, especially from Paul, that whenever we talk about the death of someone who is in Christ, it's not just called death, it's called sleeping, because we don't believe that this life is the end. We believe that true life is still to come, a new creation with Jesus, and he's almost like alluding to the future, kind of leaving us a few breadcrumbs out there to help us understand, oh, there's something big coming. Remember I said, or Christian said last week, this new wineskins? He's giving us a little glimpse at what these new wineskins look like. She's not dead. She's sleeping. Now, again, I'm imagining this if I would have been, a couple years ago at my dad's funeral, and a guy came up to me, and we were standing there looking at the casket, and he goes, oh, your dad's not dead, he's sleeping. I would have backed away from the casket, summoned somebody to get crazy out of the room, and that's why they what? Laughed at him. We're back to Jesus. Now, Jesus is going to show them something about lack of faith. See, we have heartbroken faith, we have superstitious and almost scandalous faith, but at best, this faith that they had was lacking. These were mourners. They knew what a dead person looked like. They've done all these funerals. They'd mourned at him, played the flutes at him. They were there for this. But in this particular moment, Jesus is not only encountering a man who has heartbroken faith, and he meets him there. He's not only encountered a woman who is sitting there that is in many ways, it's almost scandalous the way she came to him, superstitious in the way that she came to him. Jesus met her there. But now he's going to meet a crowd that at best has lacking faith. So how did he respond to them? When the crowd had been what? Bye-bye. You don't get to be a part of this. You don't get to see what's about ready to happen. And it says in that moment that he went in. We learned that the people that he took in with him were Peter, Peter, James, and John. Those were the three apostles that went in with him. And then also it says he grabbed mom and dad and brought them in with him. And there they are in this room, right? And it says he took her by the hand and the girl arose. By the way, not normal. And I love the way that it's put in Mark and Luke. Jesus calls her little girl. Rise. He now not only met a dad in heartbrokenness, but I love this, by faith, he met a mom and daddy in that moment. But the crowd that lacked faith didn't get to see. See, that's what we're talking about with disciples. The disciples of Jesus are those ones that in the things that we understand about him, we trust. We put allegiance in. We say that man can, and a group of people, it says in there, laughed at him, and they missed this amazing event that took place. Jesus in Mark, he tells them not to tell anyone. How are you going to tell nobody that your daughter just rose from the dead? And we'll explain why in just a second. But here they are, and Jesus met them. Now finally it talks about Jesus gets done, and it says in there, he passed from there, and I love this next part. 2 blind men followed him crying. The idea is they just kept screaming at him. Now, just imagine for a second. Jesus is up, what Christian talked about last week, talking about new wineskins. A dad comes along, drags him off to his house, he thinks. A woman touches his tassel, and then all of a sudden he gets done healing her. He goes to the house, throws everybody out, enters into the life of his mom and dad, and as he's walking home, these 2 blind men are sitting there screaming at him, "Have mercy on us, son of David." Now, part of me would be like, dude, what now? Now, in a very cool way, the other people, right, had a heartbroken faith, a superstitious, scandalous faith, a lacking faith. But I don't want you to miss this. These guys actually had an informed faith. See that word, son of David? They knew he was the Messiah. Oh, I get who you are. Now, this is supposed to be actually ironic. All the people that could see were trying to figure out who he was, and the blind man saw it. They got it. And they're screaming out, "Son of David." And I love what Jesus does. As he entered the house that he was probably living in Capernaum, the blind men came to him. They came with him into the house. And Jesus said to them, and I love this, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" Here's the key. I am. Because faith isn't just a concept. It isn't just a construct. It isn't just this thing that we do. It is in a person. He's looking at these men that expressed who he was, truly the Messiah, and he says, "Do you believe?" And in that moment, these guys say this, yes, and the Greek word there is kurios. Not only did they understand on one end of it that he was the Messiah, Christos, the long-awaited one, the anointed one, but by what they did in calling him Lord and acknowledging who he was, they were giving him his full name, the Lord Jesus Christ. They were saying, "You're it." Again, when I talk about informed faith, they had informed faith. They got it. Now check this out. Jesus meets people that are heartbroken. Jesus meets people that are scandalous and superstitious. He meets those with lacking faith. He meets those also that have informed faith. Jesus meets those that have faith in him where they are in that moment, and he gets it. He's with them. Now, why is that so important? Because wherever you are right now, as we enter into faith, as we come to him by faith, Jesus meets us there. Always. He touched their eyes. He says to them, "According to your faith, be it done for you." And I love this. Their eyes were opened. They saw. And then Jesus sternly warned them, see that nobody knows about it. Now, why did he do that? I think there's two reasons. One is that he's starting to get a little tension out there. I think he's like, look, we got to keep it calm. My father has said I need to go to Jerusalem to die, and so we need to, in some ways, I think there was a calming down of what's going on. Look, don't tell anybody as if they're not, because we find out they do. But on the other side of it, sometimes we forget Jesus, he is truly God, but he's also truly who? He's human. I think he was just tired. Like when I think about that day, I'd be like, man, I'm going to kick my feet up, watch a little NBA playoffs. Jesus didn't, just so you know. But I think he's just tired. And so he's outside walking the guys to the door. As they were going away, here's our word. What's the word? Check this out. You're not going to believe this. A demon-oppressed man, and the word there's just demonized. I think sometimes we get into weird stuff. Just in some way, demons were affecting him, and the idea was that he was mute. Now, not everyone who is mute is because of a demon, but in this case, we get clarity. In some way, the demon was keeping his mouth shut. And he was said, brought to him. And it says, after the demon gets cast out, the mute man started to speak. Now, why is it so important that he tells us about a blind person, and then he tells us about a mute person? Well, I think in a very cool way, what he's doing is he's tying us back to Isaiah 35. When you talk about the eyes of the blind, they shall be open. When the Messiah shows up, he's going to open people's eyes. And look at the very bottom of it. Also, he's going to cause the tongue of the mute to sing to sing for joy. And he's going to couple those together. And the normal Hebrew person at that time would have gone, oh, he's talking about the Messiah. Just a reaffirmation that Jesus also responds to biblical promise, to prophetic promise. But there's something else here that's going on you got to see. See, all the while, this report is going throughout all the district. His fame is going all over the place. It says in there in verse 33 that people are marveling, saying, man, was anything ever done like this in Israel? Did Moses ever do something like this? Did Elijah or Elisha? Did anybody ever do anything like this? The answer is, holy cow, this thing is blowing my mind. And we're like, well, I mean, there's only been a few. But John, he talks about it at the end of his gospel. He says, no, if we were to try to gather up all the miracles that Jesus did, you'd never be able to contain them. He did so many of them. Jesus was in breaking with the kingdom of heaven, and everybody was seeing that Jesus truly is who he was, and lives were being transformed. But the thing I want you to see is the last sentence. He casts out demons by the prince of demons. Who said that? The Pharisees. It was a demonic faith. Now let me explain to you. By accusing him of this, we're going to find out later when we get to Matthew 12 that Jesus is going to say to this particular group of people that have said to him, oh, the only reason you're doing this is because you're casting out demons by demons. Is he's going to turn the kind of the tables on them and help them to understand that he's not the one influenced by demons, it's them. And we'll get there when we talk about it. But they're the ones that actually have demonic faith. And in fact, we're going to kind of learn about this, and I'm not going to let it out of the bag, but we're going to learn about this idea of the unpardonable sin. What? There's a sin that's unpardonable? In other words, they had a faith in which they were so gone, the idea is almost irredeemable. And we're seeing all these different groups of people. A heartbroken dad, a scandalous woman, not because she was scandalous, but because what she did in that moment was scandalous, a superstitious woman, people that were lacking faith at best. Two men that had informed faith, demonic faith. But the key Matthew wants us to get across is faith. No matter where you are in your understanding of Jesus, it's that next step. Take that step of trusting Jesus. See, there's some of you here today that you're not sure about Jesus. And you're kind of like, until I get everything together, until I understand everything, I'm going to kind of hang back a little bit. But I would say this, what you understand about Jesus, because these are people that lived with him, walked with him. They weren't crazy. They understood who he was. You have to decide what you're going to do with the Messiah. And I would say today, by faith in him, do what a synagogue ruler did. Do what a woman who's trapped in a life of menstrual bleeding. Do what 2 blind men did. Bend the knee before the Messiah, the Lord. And I promise you, Jesus will meet you there. If you're somebody even right now, you might be thinking, you know what, I've cried out to God multiple times and I don't feel like he's meeting me there. I love 1st and 2nd Corinthians. I taught them for a few years. 2 Corinthians is my favorite of Paul's letters because Paul's just so raw and real. At the very end, he talks about this idea of having this thorn in the flesh, a messenger from Satan. It kind of rings with that guy that was mute. There was in some way he was being oppressed by demons, and we might think, oh gosh, what's going on there? Well, we find out that God intentionally put it there for a reason. Because again, our God is above all things. And 3 times it says he prays. He's like, oh, Lord, can you get this thing out of it? And he learns later in life, oh, the reason God had that thing there, whatever it was, is for a reason. Paul's like, I know I'm an arrogant guy. I know I trust in myself. In fact, he confessed it earlier in 2 Corinthians 1. He goes, I had this predisposition to trust in myself instead of in God who delivers the dead. And God had to take me through some difficult things to teach me to trust in him. 3 times, God, get rid of this thing. Did Jesus meet him? Oh gosh, did Jesus meet him? He didn't take away the thorn in the flesh. He looked at Paul and he said this, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul says, therefore, I will glory all the more in my weaknesses so that I might demonstrate strong. And then he says that statement at the very end in 1 Corinthians 12 that I love. Therefore, I'm content with weaknesses, with insults, with troubles, with persecutions and difficulties for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, I am. Jesus met him there. We're not promised every ailment goes away. We're not promised that somehow that in order for Jesus to meet me there, everything is going to be puppy dogs and rainbows. But even for those of you that are in the midst of just battling through things, come to him by faith, and I promise you, Jesus will meet you there. And even if you need prayer this morning, I would say, come up here and get prayer. Maybe you've been struggling and straining and kind of not sure what you're going to do with Jesus. You maybe kind of, the way Hebrews talks about it, fallen away. Well, what are you supposed to do? By faith, come to Jesus. He'll meet you there. Now, for those of us maybe that are strong in our faith, that understand things, let me tell you this. I would say also we need to remind ourselves we are just as desperate as all the people that were just talked about that Jesus had there. We may not know it, but we too need to come to Jesus by faith. That is what disciples do. We follow not Jesus like George Michael, faith for faith for faith. We put our faith in him and we follow. That means obedience. That means allegiance. That means trust. Even as infant as it may be, we trust Jesus. We have faith in him. So wherever you are right now on that, do not leave here today. That's one of my biggest fears. I was praying through this. My greatest fear is you're going to go, oh, well, you know, it was okay. He was kind of funny, kind of not. He had told a good story. And you're going to miss the fact that this message is for you and me. Faith in Christ. That's what disciples do. This week when I started, I was kind of arrogant, thinking, how am I going to present this to the people? How is Todd going to come from on high in his time of study and bless the people with things from on high? I love how God steps into that and gave me a good old daddy rear end whooping. And this week anew, I had to learn faith in him. So in the name of the Father, who you can put your faith in the name of the Son, who you can put your faith in, and in the name of the Holy Spirit, who you can put your faith in, no matter where you're at. Oh, in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, in the name of the Holy Spirit, cornerstone. Come by faith to our triune God and realize He'll meet you there. And all God's people said, Amen.